Hello everybody. So today we're going to be going over Chapter 3 in Marriage and Family, Racial and Ethnic Family Diversity. So the objectives we're going to be covering today is we're going to take a look at both past and current immigration trends, talk about the difference between a racial group, an ethnic group, and minority group, take a look at racial and ethnic relations and conflicts, and also talk about some different families of different ethnicities. So immigration of the past, we take a look at immigration coming into the United States. We'll go ahead and first start off with Chinese immigration. A lot of young Chinese men were allowed to come into the United States to work in certain areas, certain industries. So they're allowed to come in to work for during the California Gold Rush from around the mid 1800s. They were also allowed to come in and work to connect the East Coast to the West Coast with the Transcontinental Railroad. A lot of these young men were allowed to come to the United States to work as cheap labor, but they were not allowed to bring their families or become U.S. citizens or get married here in the United States. So as we kind of continue, the Transcontinental Railroad to connect the East Coast and the West Coast ended, the Chinese Exclusion Act was put in place in 1882. And this really prevented any more of these young Chinese men to come into the United States, and the main reason was there was no longer a need for cheap labor. Later on, Congress had repealed this in the 1940s, and the reason is because there were a lot of Chinese Americans that they signed up for World War II to fight against Japan and Italy and also Germany. So out of that loyalty, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed and done away with. We've also had a lot of European immigrants coming into the United States, predominantly to a major port in Ellis Island up in New York State from 1892 to around 1924. The Industrial Revolution was at full swing during this time, so there were a lot of white Europeans that wanted to come to the United States for more freedoms, more economic opportunities, and during that time there was a lot of oppression, a lot of poverty all over Europe. So the Industrial Revolution brought about a lot of millions of immigrants from the end of the Civil War up into World War I. So urbanization really took off, which is the creation of large cities, and so all of this brought a lot of economic opportunity and also a lot of jobs, really drawing in millions of Europeans into the United States. President Calvin Coolidge signed the Immigration Act of 1924, which really significantly started to limit the amount of immigrants coming into the United States. There were so many that were coming in from 1892 to 1924 that it really got to a point where the immigration really needed to kind of become limited, and so President Calvin Coolidge did that in 1924. And in this slide here, you can see it's a map of the United States, and what it shows is the racial and ethnic diversity around the United States. So the dark blue area is going to be the most racial and ethnic diversity, which you can see is in New York State and California. And so, I mean, Texas also has a lot of diversity, and also Florida. The one thing you probably notice is that a lot of the racial and ethnic diversity is around the coast. Or border areas around the United States. So California is a major port of immigration coming into California. New York with Ellis Island was also a major port of immigrants coming into the United States from Europe. Florida, there's a lot of diversity there, and also Texas bordering Mexico and a lot of Central and South American countries. As you kind of look at the other states, not quite as much ethnic and racial diversity among those pink areas there, but it kind of gives you an idea of where the most diverse populations are regarding race and ethnicity around the United States. Some current U.S. immigration trends. The United States has more foreign-born residents than any other nation. A lot of you have heard that the United States is a melting pot. It's a nation of immigrants, which it really is. So there's roughly somewhere around 45 to probably 55 million immigrants in the United States. 75% of them are here legally. A lot of different factors in why people decide to immigrate and come to the United States. They may decide that they are refugees, they're asylum seekers, they may be moving away or trying to escape poverty or an oppressive government or gang activity. You have a lot of students that want to come to the United States for higher education, so they may get some sort of educational student visa to come in the United States. Some work visas come in the United States to work in the U.S. and some of them may decide that they want to become American citizens. Some of them may decide that they don't, but they have a work visa that allows them to actually be here, and also an immigrant visa coming in. Sometimes people also come into the United States. They will be in the process of wanting to get married to an American citizen. Maybe they're dating somebody, and so they'll have a visa that will allow them to come to the United States for a while, and they'll be allowed to stay here for a certain amount of time until they get married. And if they don't get married, there's usually an expectation that they go back to their country of origin. If you take a look at these two pie charts here, it shows that the vast majority of immigrants coming in the United States, the late 1800s, early 1900s, were actually from Europe, though a lot of white Europeans. But as we're kind of moving on into the latter part of the 20th century into the 21st century, you can see that the majority now coming to the United States are from Latin American countries, Asia, and so the racial and ethnic diversity over the last 100 years has really started to really kind of shift from certain racial and ethnic groups and nationalities to others. So let's kind of break it down and talk about the difference between a racial group, an ethnic group, and also a minority group. A racial group really has to do more so of the biological aspect of the individual, usually indicating their skin color, how much melanin they actually have in their skin. We have people of different races all over the world, different pigment colors, whether they have a lot of melanin or not very much melanin, if they're dark, if they have a dark skin color or a medium skin color or a very light skin color. We notice this really all over the world, regardless of their nationality or their ethnicity. So some examples of this are people that are Caucasian or white, black, Asian, Hispanic. When we take a look at an individual's ethnic group, it's really taking a look more of not so much the skin color of the individual, but more of the ethnicity, the nationality, where they actually coming from culturally. So it'll take a look at their nationality, what nation they come from, the food that they eat, the language that they speak, their customs, their traditions, those types of things. So some examples of that are people who are from Germany, they're from Ireland, they're from England, from Scandinavian countries, from different countries in Asia and Africa, all over the world. So ethnicity is really more about your nationality, your cultural background, your traditions, and usually what kind of signifies your ethnicity is usually going to be your last name or where your ancestors came from. Minority group, sometimes it could relate to somebody's race or ethnicity, but it can also involve somebody's religion or sex or their sexual orientation or possibly even disability. So from a sociological perspective, a minority group really doesn't have anything to do with the group size. It really has more to do with certain groups that may be experiencing less power, less privilege, more discrimination than other types of groups. So if women are not given the right to vote until 1920, they're considered a minority group. During the segregated South of the 1950s, if blacks and whites were kept separate from each other, or African Americans or certain groups were not given certain rights and opportunities, well, they're considered a minority group. If there's certain parts of the world where certain religions experience more discrimination and oppression than others, well, then they would be considered a minority group. So minority groups, again, from a sociological perspective, really takes a look at certain groups that may be struggling for certain rights and opportunities, whether it's in the United States or other countries really around the world. And it's not so much really about the size. A lot of times we think about a minority group being the smallest size. Well, women outnumber men, so their population numbers are larger, but women are considered a minority group in the United States because they experience more sexism, more discrimination in the workplace, and they experience more sexual assault, even though their numbers outnumber men. If we take a look at the upper class is the smallest class in the United States compared to the middle class, the working class, and lower class. However, they have the most power, the most privilege, and the most opportunity. So it's really not so much about size, it's really more about your position in society and what opportunities that you actually have. So taking a look at this, we can take a look at these three pie charts here, and basically what it's showing you here is the percentage of racial and ethnic diversity in the United States and where it was in the past, where it kind of is right now, and the direction that it's kind of moving towards. And so this shows 1950, 2010, and also in 2025. So it shows in 1950 around 86% of Americans were white. As we move into 2010, it's around 64%. So one thing you'll notice is that the white population, those overall percentages are going down, while other races and ethnic groups are actually rising. Some of this does have to do with immigration patterns, but another factor of this is that whites tend to have lower birth rates than other races and ethnicities, and whites right now are experiencing what's called a negative birth rate, which means that there are more white people in the United States dying than actually being born. So there's a lot of contributing factors that are contributing to the racial and ethnic diversity here in the United States. And so far, it's projected to kind of continue moving into the future in this same pattern that we've seen over the last 75 years. All right, so let's talk about some ethnic relations and also conflict. So segregation, this is the process of keeping certain races and ethnic groups or groups of people separate from each other in society. If you take a look at this picture here, you can see that this is during whenever the South was segregated prior to 1964, and you see an African American young lady drinking from separate water fountains. So segregation is whenever you're keeping certain groups separate from each other. It could be using separate water fountains, separate restrooms, sitting in different areas of the restaurant, sitting in different areas of a train or even a bus. So that's segregation. S for separation. Integration is coming together. As you can see in this photograph here, you see a couple young boys in school of different races sitting right next to each other. So integration is allowing people from different races and ethnicities to come together, to be part of mainstream society together, to work together, to go to school together, to sit next to each other in restaurants, on planes and trains, and all these different areas of society. So that is integration. The next two ethnic relations we'll talk about is assimilation. So assimilation, A for absorption. This is pretty common when it comes to immigration. So whenever immigrants coming to the United States, if they take on if they take on the mannerisms and they become more Americanized, and they are being absorbed into the American culture. So if they learn English, or they decide they want to become Christian, or if they decide that they want to become an American citizen and they take on the values of democracy and capitalism and individuality, they're slowly kind of being absorbed into the American culture, which is referred to as Anglo-conformity assimilation. So a lot of immigrants have voluntarily come into the United States and wanted to actually do this. There are some racial and ethnic groups that have not voluntarily come to the United States, and they've experienced assimilation. Not so much from a voluntary perspective, but involuntary. So an example of this would be African slaves coming into the United States, and a lot of the assimilation to American culture being kind of forced upon them to change their religion or their name or some of their traditions. The same thing goes for, there's a lot of pressure to put on Native Americans to assimilate into American culture. So assimilation is the process of kind of being absorbed, and so there are some economic opportunities that come, because once you become more absorbed into a particular culture, you're more accepted. but the price that you pay for that is that you lose part of your individuality, some of your heritage, some of your cultural background. So most immigrants that have come into the United States as the decades go by, and pretty much everybody that's in the United States now have slowly become Americanized, is that you become more absorbed into a dominant culture, but at the same time you lose part of your heritage and your background. So my last name is Blanchard, and so my ancestors, they came from France. There's very little about me that's French at all, because my ancestors, they came to the United States and we slowly became Americanized, which is, again, Anglo-conformity assimilation. Cultural pluralism, this is the process of really trying to resist not becoming either Americanized in the United States or assimilated into a particular culture. So this is whenever an ethnic group attempts to avoid assimilating into the dominant culture and really to hold on to their cultural distinctiveness. So Native Americans that have decided to stay on the reservations and hold on to their religion and their customs. We have a lot of different neighborhoods that are in New York City. New York City was a major import of a lot of immigrants, European immigrants, into that area through Ellis Island. So there's a whole lot of diversity in different types of neighborhoods. So, one example is Chinatown. You have other areas that are predominantly German or Jewish or Irish. And so they're trying to hold on to their uniqueness, their cultural distinctiveness. So that's referred to as cultural pluralism. So next we'll talk a little bit about ethnic conflicts. So the first term is called stereotyping. Stereotyping is kind of a broad generalized belief that certain groups of people are a certain way. It could be based on your race or ethnicity, your sex, your sexual orientation. It could be pretty much any category at all. Sometimes stereotyping will lead to prejudice and discrimination. So prejudice is to prejudge, having a negative attitude about certain groups of people. If you discriminate, this is an action. You start to exclude certain groups from certain rights and opportunities. So if you prohibit women from the right to vote, well, that's a form of discrimination. If you don't rent your home to certain people because of their race or their ethnicity or their religion, then that is going to be an example of discrimination. Racism is the perception that one's race or ethnic group is superior to other, and it will often lead to prejudiced attitudes or even discriminatory actions. Racial profiling, this is a perspective that certain races or ethnic groups or even religions are more likely to commit crimes, and so they may be monitored more closely, pulled over and in their vehicles, or screened more closely at the airport, or followed around more in stores. They're basically being judged by the way that they look. It could be their skin color, it could be the clothes that they're wearing, or it could be their ethnicity. Some other ethnic conflicts we have is called mass expulsion. Mass expulsion is the process of really pushing an ethnic group off of their land. There's usually a dominant ethnic group that wants to inhabit those resources, to take those resources, or to really kind of segregate and push that group off of their land. It's also known as ethnic cleansing. So moving Native Americans off their land onto reservation is an example of mass expulsion. Taking a group of people from one continent to another, transporting African slaves to the United States or different parts of the world, is also another example of mass expulsion. Sometimes through the process of mass expulsion, genocide may occur. This is intentionally or systematically trying to kill off an entire race of people or an ethnic group. So the Native Americans experience this as there was a lot of conflict between Native Americans and some of the earliest European colonists, and also whenever the United States was actually established. So they experienced mass expulsion and also genocide as well. We think about World War II and the Holocaust of the Jews. Other areas of the world that experienced genocide is in Rwanda. There was 2 tribes there in the 1990s that were in heavy conflict, where about 1 million people were killed between the tribes of Hutu and Tutsi. And we also know that genocide is also experienced in a part of Africa known as Darfur. So a lot of times the process of pushing people off their land and also violence against them will go hand in hand. and this is known as mass expulsion and also genocide. If you take a look at hate crimes, and hate crime is going to be a crime where people are targeted specifically because they fit into a certain category. It could be the color of their skin, their ethnicity, the nation that they come from, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their disability. It could be pretty much across the board. The number one factor of hate crimes is usually tied into one's race or ethnicity. But if we take specifically and just look at religion alone in the United States, the group that experiences the most hate crimes is going to be Jews here in the United States. We've seen an uptick of hate crimes over the last several years based on a lot of different categories, but it's predominantly based on race and ethnicity. And again, if you're looking just at religion, Jews experience more hate crimes than other religions. All right, so moving on to, we're going to take a look at different families of ethnicity. So first off, we have Latino American families. So they are the largest ethnic minority group in the United States. Their numbers are somewhere between 62 and 65 million. The majority of them are born in the United States, and the number of eligible voters are rising each and every year. And this is something that both Democrats, Republicans, and Independents are looking at pretty heavily because they are a huge voting bloc. Some of the characteristics of Latino Americans: a lot of respect and reverence for their family members, for the elderly within their family, extended family. When it comes to religion, most are Roman Catholic, but there's also a lot of religious diversity among Latinos as well. They tend to value traditional gender roles, education, and also hard work. But as more and more Latino Americans are becoming more and more Americanized, the younger Latinos are kind of moving away from traditional gender roles and really starting to take on more of the value of egalitarianism, where there's a lot of gender equality. So the educational, the social, and the economic status are rising among Latino Americans. There's also a lot of diversity among Latino Americans. So the majority do come from Mexico, but we notice that Latino Americans come from all different types of countries and different parts of the world. Central American countries, South American countries, Cuba, Puerto Rico, even Spain. So there's a lot of racial and ethnic diversity among Latino Americans. African Americans, so they are the second largest ethnic minority group in the United States. Their numbers are somewhere between 47 and 50 million. Long history of slavery, segregation, and discrimination. They went through two major social movements: the abolitionist movement to end slavery in the 1800s, the civil rights movement to end segregation, to bring about more voting rights and more opportunities, educational rights. So as an ethnic group, going through two major social movements that brought about a lot more equality, economic equality, social equality for African Americans. So slavery was abolished, given citizenship and voting, and also voting rights in the 1800s. African American women were given it in 1920, along with women across the board. That was known as the 19th Amendment. Segregation was ended, and also another thing that came out of the civil rights movement was anti-miscegenation laws also ended as well. Anti-miscegenation laws are laws that prohibit interracial marriage, and the main U.S. Supreme Court case that ended anti-miscegenation laws is Loving versus Virginia. So this was a couple out of Virginia. It was Richard Loving, which was a white male in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, who married his wife, who was half black and half Native American. Virginia had anti-miscegenation laws that prohibited them from getting married, so they went out of state, they got married, they came back to Virginia, they got arrested. They sued the state of Virginia, and they lost, so they took their court case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1967. They actually won. So overnight, anti-miscegenation laws were done away with nationwide, and which basically allowed people from different races and ethnicities to get married to each other openly. So it's a very famous court case called Loving versus Virginia. So also African Americans, their educational attainment has been going up, social attainment, economic status has been rising for decades upon decades. If we take a look at this next slide here, it's a map of the United States. This goes along with Loving versus Virginia. It shows that all these red states down here in the South along the Bible Belt, these were all the states that did not allow interracial marriage. It shows that there were a lot of different northern states that did allow interracial marriage up until 1967. So again, whenever Loving versus Virginia went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1967 and they won, pretty much, I mean, nationwide, people of different races and ethnicities could openly get married to each other. So all these states in red overnight had to allow interracial marriage. It's a very close comparison to what happened in 2015 whenever same-sex marriage went to the U.S. Supreme Court and same-sex marriage became legalized nationwide, and all the southern states had to now allow same-sex marriage across the board. The next ethnic group we'll talk about are Asian American families. They're the third largest ethnic minority group. They're also the fastest growing, somewhere around 22 million. Some of the characteristics tend to have higher marriage rates. Their children are more likely to be raised in two-parent households, so their divorce rates tend to be pretty low, so their families tend to be intact. High educational attainment, the highest median incomes of any race or ethnicity in the United States, low poverty rates, low crime rates, the longest life expectancy of other races and ethnicities in the United States. And so because of all of these various characteristics, they were given the title of the model minority in the United States. I believe this term came out in the 1980s of Asian Americans. But there's also a lot of diversity among Asian Americans. So most of them, they do come from China. We mentioned earlier that a lot of Chinese immigrants, they came into the United States to work in during the gold rush, the Transcontinental Railroad, but they also worked in the coal mines as well. But you see a lot of diversity. I mean, Asia is a very large continent with a lot of different countries. So Asian Americans, they come from China and India, the Filipino, from Vietnam, Korea, Japan, a lot of different countries. But the majority of Asian Americans in the United States are from China. Native American families. So in 1830, President Andrew Jackson put in place the Indian Removal Act. This created what's known as the Trail of Tears, which pushed Native Americans up into the Oklahoma territories. So this is called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So this is a prime example of mass expulsion, pushing people off of their land from one area to another. So that was not only to segregate Native Americans into certain areas, but it also allowed the connecting of the Transcontinental Railroad from the East Coast to the West Coast. There was also very valuable resources that wanted to be mined. So whether it was coal or gold wanted to be mined, by pushing Native Americans, it allowed for easier access to those resources. So there's a lot of diversity among Native Americans. The largest is Cherokee, but there's over 500 recognized tribes. Some of the characteristics: very great respect or reverence for their elderly, tend to be spiritual and valuing nature and conservation, tend to be culturally pluralistic, so there's a lot of diversity there. Higher poverty rates, especially on reservations. Native Americans have the highest percentage living in poverty among all races and ethnic groups, especially those living on the reservations. Those numbers are somewhere around 25% living in poverty. And they also have the lowest life expectancy on the national average compared to other races and also ethnic groups. Lastly, we'll talk about Arab American families. So there's a lot of diversity here among Middle Eastern countries. So it's somewhere between 3.7 and 5 million Arab Americans in the United States. Most of them are native born here in the U.S. 82% to 85% of them are U.S. citizens. So they come from a lot of different countries all over the Middle East. So Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Palestine, Iraq, Jordan, Yemen, parts of North Africa and Southwest Asia. So a lot of diversity there. So some of the characteristics tend to be ethnically and religiously diverse, but most of them are Muslim. Instead of sociologists using terms like Muslim American, they use Arab American, because not all Arab Americans practice or are Muslim or practice the faith of Islam. So that's why the term Arab American is being used more than rather than Muslim American, because not all people from Middle Eastern countries are Muslim. So it's extremely high respect for their elderly. Um, Traditional gender roles, they tend to be patriarchal families, but just like a lot of Asian American families, um, and also Latino American families, a lot of the younger generations are moving away from patriarchy to more of egalitarianism. And what this shows you is that more and more immigrants that are coming into the United States, as they become more and more Americanized, they tend to become less patriarchal, and they become much more egalitarian with a lot of gender equality, especially among the younger generations. Education is a very, very high priority among Arab Americans, and hospitality to guests is expected. So anytime that there's a guest coming to their home, definitely try to make them feel welcome within those environments. So these are some of the major ethnic groups here in the United States, and that will end this chapter. Thank you very much.